Hello again, students. I hope your Thursday is even better than it was before. This is the title of our unit, Civil Rights and Liberties, and here is LT5, Analyze Important Supreme Court Cases Dealing with Federalism and Executive Power. So the unit is Civil Rights and Liberties, but we also kind of throw in this little learning target that deals with court cases that have nothing to do with civil rights and liberties, which is why I kind of said earlier this should almost be called like the Supreme Court case unit as opposed to civil rights and liberties. So we're going to knock this one out in a flip lesson today. We're talking about cases dealing with federalism and executive power. So buckle in and listen up. You don't have this slide because I decided to get rid of it so I could keep the slide to 6 slides, or keep your sheet to 6 slides so it could all be on one page front and back. If I was you, just to keep things organized and to focus on your purpose, I would write the learning target on the top. Just write LT5, Analyze Supreme Court Cases Dealing with Federalism and Executive Power. So when you look back at that in the future, you know exactly what the learning target was. First slide, another slide that I did not include on the slide handout is this one right here. I didn't include it because you've heard of these before. You should know them very well. But just in case you didn't, I thought I would throw them in. Marbury v. Madison and McCulloch v. Maryland. You can read the details here. Obviously, Marbury v. Madison is the judicial review case. And this one over here is kind of hard to explain, but essentially, this is where judicial review is first used on the legislative branch, and specifically the state legislative branch. So soak that in, and then think about this question. If this learning target is about cases dealing with federalism and executive power, which of those concepts do Marbury and McCulloch address? Okay. One of these cases, the Marbury case and the McCulloch case, addresses both federalism and executive power. The other one only addresses federalism. You decide which is which. Think that through, come up with that answer in your head, talk to your neighbors if need be later on. Okay, now this is on your slides. I'm going to go through quickly. You can read the details. I'm just going to touch on the important stuff. Gitlow versus New York was when selective incorporation occurred. Provide a brief description of the Gitlow case. Use a web source if you need to. So I'm saying this because we've learned this case before. What was Gitlow versus New York? What happened that led to there being a Supreme Court case? I want you to think about that. If you know that answer, write it down on your right side. I will be checking that. If you don't know that answer, you may use web sources. Which web sources, you ask? Well, if you go to the haiku page for Unit 6, underneath the unit documents and links, I have an entire block that has good sources for learning about Supreme Court cases. So feel free to go and check that out. Go to haiku, go to the Unit 6 page. You'll see some links to some good web sources if you need them. Hopefully you don't need them because we've learned that before. Moving on. South Dakota versus Dole, you have not learned before. Kind of a tough one here. I think I've mentioned this idea. It goes back to federalism. So if a state doesn't want to cooperate with what the federal government wants, the federal government can just kind of hold money over their head and say, well, if you don't do what we want, you're not going to get this federal highway money, which is exactly what the government did to South Dakota. Among other states, South Dakota was just the party named in the case here. So basically, they wanted states to raise the drinking age to 21 years old. States said no. Then the federal government said, well, if you don't do that, you're not going to get any money. The Supreme Court found that the federal government could do that. It was constitutional for the federal government to withhold federal funds in a case like that. Here I have a nice little visual reminder from the great movie Superbad. Think about this, folks. Fill in the blank, a type of grant. And then kind of jot that down, make note of that on your right side. U.S. versus Lopez is a gun control Supreme Court case. The federal government had this, here it is, the Gun-Free School Zone Act, okay? And what happened was a kid got popped with a pistol in the school zone, and he got in trouble, but then somebody, I can't remember who, basically sued them and said the Congress has no right to create this act. Constitutionally, it doesn't say in the Constitution that Congress can create a gun-free school zone act. The Supreme Court agreed. Right? So basically, the Supreme Court said carrying a gun is not an economic activity. Therefore, it could not be regulated by Congress via the Commerce Clause. So essentially, Congress said, yeah, we can do this because of the Commerce Clause. We have the right to regulate commerce. So the Supreme Court said a school zone being gun-free is not economic. Therefore, you cannot do it via the Commerce Clause. And if you can't do it via the Commerce Clause, there's no other part of the Constitution that says you can do it. Therefore, you can't do it at all. Moving on to Karamatsu versus the United States. The Supreme Court upheld an executive order that interned or put Japanese Americans into internment camps, which deprived them of their basic constitutional rights. Kind of a bad part of U.S. history here. We kind of regret that. So basically, the U.S. was putting Japanese people in a concentration camp, and someone sued the U.S. government, and the Supreme Court said the U.S. government is okay to do that anyway. Looking back, not so smart when it comes to history, but we see that coming up again. This is very similar to what Trump is proposing with a ban on Muslims. If he were to become president and he did put forth an executive order banning Muslims, it would be just like this case. And I guarantee they would reference this case if that were to happen. Do you think the Supreme Court would make the same decision today? Let's say if Trump did put out an executive order that banned Muslims from the country and somebody challenged that in the Supreme Court, what would the Supreme Court decide? That's just kind of for you to think about. Moving on, we're almost done. Congress wanted Nixon's tapes of his Oval Office conversations. You're aware of this in the whole Watergate scandal. This was U.S. versus Nixon. It had to do with executive privilege, which we've learned about before. The court said that executive privilege is real, that you can't force the president to testify and you can't take his tapes and things of that nature. So they said executive privilege is real. However, in the case of criminal cases, there is no executive privilege. So in the end, Nixon was then involved in a criminal case. Once more information came out, then he could not use executive privilege and he did have to turn the tapes over, which is what led to his ultimate impeachment and resignation. Clinton versus New York is the line item veto case. Maybe you want to circle that. Know that Clinton versus New York is the line item veto case. So we've learned before that line item veto is not legal to use by a president. This was the case that made it so. So it was all the way up until 1998 that a president could use a line item veto. Actually, maybe not. It gets a little more complicated than that. But basically, Clinton was using the line item veto to do some stuff. Somebody challenged it in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that the line item veto basically is like the president amending bills and making laws, which is a violation of separation of powers. You can see some of this here. And you've seen this question before. Go ahead and circle the right answer again. That's all I got. Now, here's your job. With your partner, whom hopefully you already have or you're figuring out shortly, choose one of these and create a Google drawing that represents it. And the guidelines are in that shared folder that I led you to before. Now I say choose one, but choose one that another group's not doing. So as a class, and you guys are a marvelous group, so I know you can do this, each group of partners gets one of these. So decide who's going to do what. If you have any disputes, play rock, paper, scissors. And you have the rest of the hour to essentially create a Google drawing that represents the consequences and effects of each of these cases. You also need to take the LT5 practice quiz, which is on the bottom of the Unit 6 page. Do all that now. You got the rest of the hour to work on this. If you get done with all that, work on your reading guide. Have a good weekend. I miss you.